primary target is the industrial sector in Dusseldorf. Stick to the briefed altitude through this corridor to avoid the heavy flak batteries marked here.
On the night of February 13th to 14th, 1945, more than 1,000 RAF bombers flew to Dresden, a city in the east of Germany that had not been heavily bombed during the war, that contained hundreds of thousands of German refugees who had fled the Soviet advance, and that the German government had declared an open city. 2 waves of bombers dropped approximately 2,400 tons of bombs, a mix of high explosives and incendiaries that created a firestorm that burned for days. American bombers followed the next morning. The casualty figures have been disputed for decades. Estimates have ranged from 22,000 to 500,000 dead, with the scholarly consensus settling at approximately 22,700 to 25,000, the lower end of the estimates, though the number remains contested. The city that had been called the Florence of the Elbe, the Baroque capital of Saxony, one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, was devastated. The officer who ordered the Dresden raid was Arthur Travers Harris, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, Commander-in-Chief of RAF Bomber Command from February 1942 until the end of the war. He was known as Bomber Harris to the public and, less affectionately, as Butcher Harris to some of the men who served under him, though the epithet was applied more by later critics than by his contemporaries. He had spent 3 years building the largest and most destructive strategic bombing force in the history of warfare, had developed and executed a campaign that killed approximately 300,000 German civilians and injured another 800,000, had destroyed hundreds of thousands of homes and reduced major German cities to rubble, and had done all of this in the specific belief that area bombing of German cities was both strategically necessary and strategically decisive. He was right about some of it. He was wrong about some of it. He was never adequately honored for what he was right about, and he was never adequately held to account for what he was wrong about. And the specific combination of partial rightness and partial wrongness applied to the instrument of the most destructive air campaign against civilian targets in history has made him one of the most contested figures of the entire Second World War. This is the story of Arthur Harris. The determination, the intelligence, the specific operational achievement, the civilian dead, the question of whether area bombing was a war crime, and the specific injustice of man who was used and then discarded by the country that directed him to do what he did. Before I go further, I want to ask you directly. Subscribe if you haven't already. The next episode is about General Stilwell, the most hated American general of the war, the man who told Chiang Kai-shek things no one else would say, who was right about Chinese corruption and wrong about almost everything else, and who managed to make enemies of everyone he worked with while achieving real things anyway. That episode is coming soon. Subscribe and hit the bell. And if the Harris story makes you genuinely uncomfortable, if the bombing of Dresden sits with you differently after this episode, hit the like button so more people find this series. Back to Harris. Back to the man who burned German cities and was never forgiven for it. The specific comparison between the RAF area bombing campaign and the American precision bombing campaign, the 2 Allied strategic bombing approaches that were conducted simultaneously and that produced different results, illuminates Harris's specific position within the broader Allied bombing effort and the specific debate about what the strategic bombing campaign was actually for. The American 8th Air Force, which operated from England alongside Bomber Command, was committed to the daylight precision bombing of specific military and industrial targets rather than to the area bombing of German cities. The American doctrine, developed before the war at the Air Corps Tactical School and maintained through the early years of the European campaign, despite the heavy losses that daylight operations over Germany produced, held that precision bombing of specific bottleneck targets in the German war economy could produce decisive results without the area destruction that Harris was pursuing. The specific targets that the Americans pursued, aircraft factories, ball bearing plants, oil refineries, railroad marshalling yards, were genuine bottleneck targets whose destruction would impose specific constraints on the German war economy. The problem was achieving precision in the face of German fighter opposition and German weather. The Schweinfurt raids of 1943, in which the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day attacking the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, demonstrated that unescorted daylight bombing of defended targets deep in Germany was producing casualties that the American air forces could not sustain. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang long-range escort fighter in early 1944 changed the equation for daylight bombing, and the subsequent American campaign against German oil production, launched in the spring of 1944 over Harris's objections, produced the decisive strategic effects that the precision bombing advocates had predicted. The destruction of German synthetic oil production was a specific strategic achievement that most clearly validated the precision bombing concept, and it was an achievement that Harris had actively resisted. Harris's resistance to the oil campaign was not irrational in the specific terms of his strategic theory. He believed that area bombing was producing more strategic effect than the precision bombing of specific facilities, and he was concerned that diverting Bomber Command resources to precision targeting would reduce the cumulative pressure on the German war economy and civilian morale that he believed the area bombing was producing. The specific evidence that was available to him in 1944 did not conclusively resolve the debate between the two approaches, and his resistance reflected a genuine strategic disagreement rather than simple institutional territorialism. He was wrong about the oil campaign and the subsequent evidence. German records showing the specific impact of oil production destruction on German military operations has established this clearly, but his wrongness was a professional judgment made in conditions of genuine strategic uncertainty, not the kind of obvious error that benefits from hindsight. The strategic bombing debate of 1944 was genuinely complex, and the specific men who were making the decisions were doing so with incomplete information about what the effects of their choices were. The specific relationship between Harris and Portal, Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, Chief of the Air Staff, who was Harris's superior and who pressed him repeatedly to shift more resources to precision targeting, is one of the more interesting command relationships of the war. Portal understood the strategic case for precision targeting better than Harris, and he pressed Harris consistently to accept the shift. Harris resisted with a tenacity that Portal found exhausting and specific dynamic. The superior who was correct about the strategy pressing subordinate, who was executing the operational plan with great effectiveness, produced a tension that characterized the British strategic bombing effort for much of the war. Portal never ordered Harris directly to abandon area bombing, partly because Harris's operational effectiveness made removing him politically difficult, and partly because of specific British political commitment to the area bombing campaign, which had been publicly defended and which public opinion expected continue, made a dramatic strategic shift difficult to justify. The specific institutional constraints that prevented the most direct management of Harris were as much political as military, and they reflect the broader pattern of the British war effort in which strategic military decisions were constrained by domestic political considerations. The specific men who were killed in the German cities, the approximately 300,000 German civilians who died in the bombing campaign, were specific people with specific lives, families, and histories that the strategic analysis converts into a number. They deserve acknowledgement as something more than a casualty figure. They were overwhelmingly the non-military population of Germany: women, children, the elderly, the workers who maintained the industrial economy, who died under bombs that were directed at the cities they lived in rather than at them specifically. The specific question of whether they were collectively responsible for the Nazi regime and therefore legitimate targets of retributive bombing is one that Harris and some of his supporters have made, and it is one that the moral philosophy has generally rejected. Collective punishment, the targeting of a population for crimes of government, is one of the specific prohibitions that the laws of war are developed to protect civilian populations, and a specific application of this principle to the German civilian population does not produce an answer that supports the area bombing campaign. The German civilians who died in the bombing were not the people who had voted for Hitler, or the people who had designed the Holocaust, or the people who had ordered the invasion of Poland. They were, in many cases, people who had been born into the Nazi Germany that had been built before they were old enough to have any political responsibility for it, or people who had been overruled by the political dynamics of a totalitarian state and who had no effective alternative to living under the regime. Collective punishment of a civilian population is not a morally acceptable response to the crimes of a totalitarian government, regardless of what those crimes were. Harris's argument for the area bombing, that the German civilian population support for the Nazi regime made them legitimate targets, does not survive this examination, and the honest assessment of the bombing campaign requires acknowledging this. But the honest assessment also requires acknowledging that the German industrial economy, the factories, the transportation networks, the communications infrastructure, was in the cities that the bombing campaign targeted, and that the destruction of this infrastructure was a legitimate military objective. The specific challenge of area bombing is that the legitimate military targets and the illegitimate civilian targets were in the same places, and the specific technology of the era did not allow reliable discrimination between them. This challenge does not fully justify the area bombing campaign. It does explain why the campaign took the form it took rather than the precision targeting that would have been morally preferable. The explanation is not a justification. The fact that precision was not achievable does not make the alternative acceptable, but it provides a specific context in which the decisions were made, and the honest assessment requires that context alongside the moral assessment. Harris made specific decisions within a specific context, under specific constraints, directed by specific institutional authorities. The full accounting of what he did and what it cost requires all of this context: the decisions, the constraints, the directions, the results, and the costs, held in the same frame without simplification in either direction. He built the force. He burned the cities. He helped win the war. He was discarded by the government that directed him. He was right about some things and wrong about others. He lived to 91 and died without the full acknowledgement that his service deserved. The men who flew for him deserved the campaign medal they were denied. The civilians who died under his bombs deserved to live. The government that directed the campaign deserved to bear more of the moral cost than it was willing to acknowledge. And the historical record that has been assembled in the decades since deserves to be read and engaged within the spirit of honest reckoning that requires. That is the full accounting of the Harris War. The broader question of whether the Allied strategic bombing campaign was a war crime, a question that has been raised by historians, legal scholars, and politicians since the end of the war, is one that the historical record illuminates without fully resolving, and it deserves direct engagement because it is the central moral question of the Harris story. The laws of war as they existed in 1945 did not contain a specific prohibition on strategic bombing of civilian areas. The Hague Conventions of 1907, which were the primary international law governing land warfare at the time, had not been fully applied to aerial warfare, and the specific rules about the protection of civilian populations from deliberate attack were less clearly established in the law of aerial warfare than in the law of land warfare. The post-war development of international humanitarian law, particularly the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the additional protocols of 1977, has produced a legal framework that would clearly prohibit the area bombing campaign if it were conducted today. The specific question of whether the 1945 laws, rather than the subsequently developed standards, should be applied to the Harris campaign is one that the legal scholars have addressed. The argument for applying 1945 standards, that people can only be held to the laws that existed at the time of their actions, is a principle of fundamental fairness that has broad support in both legal philosophy and in the specific conduct of the post-war trials. The argument for applying subsequently developed standards, that the underlying moral principles that the later law codified were present and recognizable in 1945, is also a serious argument with genuine legal and philosophical support. The Nuremberg Principles, which were developed specifically in the context of the post-war trials, and which established the principle that certain acts are crimes against humanity regardless of whether they were legal under the laws of the active state, are relevant to this debate. The specific application of these principles to the Allied bombing campaign was not pursued. The victors were not tried. But the principles themselves, once established, apply to all parties, including the Allies. The specific moral philosopher's version of this question, whether the area bombing of German cities was morally justified even if it was not legally prohibited, is one that raises the specific arguments about the relationship between military necessity and civilian harm that the just war tradition has been working through since Aquinas. The specific question of whether the destruction of Hamburg and Dresden was proportionate to the military objectives pursued is one that the just war tradition requires asking, and the specific answer that the military objectives pursued in February 1945 were not proportionate to the scale of the civilian harm caused is not easily dismissed. Harris would have dismissed it. He dismissed such arguments throughout his career, and the specific character of his dismissal, the stubbornness, the certainty, the refusal to engage with moral arguments that threatened his strategic theory, is part of the full picture of who he was. He was not a man who lacked moral imagination. He was a man who had decided that the moral arithmetic of the bombing campaign came out in favor of the bombing, and who was not going to be talked out of that decision by arguments he had already rejected. The specific historical assessment of the bombing campaign has produced a range of conclusions across the spectrum from full moral justification to full moral condemnation. The most thoughtful assessments, those of historians like Richard Overy and Tammy Biddle, who have engaged most seriously with both the operational history and the moral questions, tend toward a position of complex acknowledgement. The bombing campaign was an essential component of the Allied victory. It was conducted in ways that went beyond what military necessity required. It produced civilian casualties that were not fully justified by the strategic effect achieved, and it was directed by a government that bore primary responsibility for the campaign, and that unfairly attempted to offload that responsibility onto Harris after the war. This position requires holding the bomber crew's courage and the civilian dead's humanity simultaneously, refusing the simplification that makes a campaign either a heroic achievement or criminal atrocity, and insisting on the full complexity of both. The specific cities that the bombing campaign destroyed have rebuilt themselves in the decades since the war, and the specific human communities that the destruction disrupted have reconstituted and have developed their own relationships to the history of the bombing. Dresden, which was destroyed in the last weeks of a war that was already being won, has maintained a specific identity as a victim of the bombing, an identity that was exploited by the East German government during the Cold War as propaganda against the Western Allies, and that has been complicated by the subsequent scholarship that revised the casualty estimates downward from the inflated figures that the East German and Nazi propaganda had promoted. The specific Dresden casualty revision, from the 100,000 to 500,000 figures that Cold War propaganda maintained to the scholarly consensus of approximately 22,700 to 25,000, is itself an instructive story about how historical claims are made and revised, and what the process of revision reveals about the political uses of historical narrative. The inflated figures serve specific political purposes: the East German government's anti-Western propaganda, and earlier, the Nazi government's attempt to mobilize domestic and international opinion against the bombing campaign. The scholarly revision, which was resisted for decades and which required access to the Dresden municipal records that were only fully available after German reunification, is the product of the same kind of patient archival work that has revised other contested historical claims. The revised figures do not make the Dresden raid morally acceptable. 25,000 dead civilians in a single night at the end of a war that was already decided is still a catastrophe that demands moral reckoning. But the specific revision from propaganda-inflated figures to scholarly estimates is important because it establishes a specific scale of the event more accurately, and because accurate historical claims are the foundation of honest moral assessment. Harris never accepted the moral argument against the bombing campaign, and his refusal to do so was consistent with a character that had committed itself completely to a strategic theory, and that was not going to revise that commitment in the face of historical or moral evidence. This consistency is itself a specific quality, the same quality that had made him so effective in building and directing the bombing campaign was the quality that made it impossible for him to accept the moral critique of what the campaign had done. He was, in a specific sense, the right person for the job he was given and the wrong person to be asked to reflect honestly on what the job had cost. The specific combination, the operational genius and the moral inflexibility, was a combination that the British government had employed and that it subsequently found inconvenient when the moral dimension of the campaign became politically uncomfortable. The specific injustice of his post-war treatment is not that he should have been celebrated rather than criticized. It is that the government that directed the campaign bore a greater share of the moral responsibility than it was willing to publicly acknowledge, and that Harris bore a disproportionate share of the public moral cost of decisions that were not his alone. He was used. He was effective. He was discarded. He was right about some things and wrong about others. He was never adequately acknowledged for the things he was right about and never adequately held to account for the things he was wrong about. That is a specific injustice that his story poses. And it is an injustice that the historical record has documented even if the specific institutional actors responsible for it have never fully acknowledged it. The men who flew for him were real. Their courage was real. The civilians who died under his bombs were real. The government that directed the campaign and then distanced itself from it was real. The moral weight of the campaign and the moral weight of the institutional cowardice that followed it are both real and both belong in the full accounting. Harris burned the cities. Britain directed him to do it. The cities burned. The men flew and died. The civilians died under bombs. The war was won, partly through what the bombing campaign achieved and partly through what it cost the German defenses and German industry and German morale. The full accounting requires all of it. That is the Harris War. The specific air crews who flew the Bomber Command raids, the men who delivered the bombs that Harris ordered, deserve examination as the specific human beings they were, because the mythology of Bomber Command has tended to reduce them either to heroic instruments of Allied victory or to unwilling participants in a morally compromised campaign, when the full reality of their experience was more complex and more human than either simplification allows. The aircrew of RAF Bomber Command were, for the most part, young men, many of them in their late teens or early 20s, who had volunteered for aircrew service in the knowledge that the casualty rate in Bomber Command was among the highest of any military service in the war. The specific statistics were known. Over the course of the war, approximately 55,573 RAF Bomber Command aircrew were killed out of approximately 125,000 who served, a mortality rate of approximately 44%. A tour of operations consisted of 30 missions. The statistical probability of completing a 30-mission tour without being killed was, at the height of the campaign against Germany, approximately 17%. The men who flew these missions understood the arithmetic. They flew anyway, whether this constitutes heroism in conventional sense, and it does by any reasonable definition. It also requires acknowledgement of the specific context in which the courage was exercised. They were brave. They were also being directed to carry out missions whose strategic rationale was contested and whose moral status was uncomfortable. The combination of personal courage and institutional direction to do something morally complicated is part of the full truth of what Bomber Command's aircrew experienced. The specific experience of a bombing raid over Germany, the hours of flight in the darkness, the flak that threw up shells to the altitude of the bombers, the German night fighters that hunted the stream of aircraft, the specific terror of being in a Lancaster that was coned by searchlights and fired on from multiple directions, was one of the most extreme combat experiences of the entire war. Men who survived multiple tours carried the specific psychological weight of that experience throughout their lives, and the specific inadequacy of the post-war recognition. The denial of the campaign medal was experienced by them as a specific institutional insult that their government had imposed on their service. The 7-man crew of a Lancaster bomber, the pilot, the navigator, the bomb aimer, the flight engineer, the wireless operator, the mid-upper gunner, and the rear gunner formed the specific intimate unit in which the bombing campaign was actually experienced. Each of these positions carried specific risks and specific responsibilities, and the relationships between the men of a crew, formed in training and deepened by the specific intimacy of shared danger, were often the most intense relationships of their lives. Men who survived the war and lived old age frequently described their crew relationships as more important than any other relationships except their immediate families. The specific men who were killed, the 55,573, who did not come back from a mission, left behind specific families in Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the other countries of the Commonwealth that contributed aircrew to Bomber Command. Their deaths were the specific human cost of the campaign on the Allied side, and they deserve acknowledgement alongside the civilian deaths in Germany that the campaign produced. The Bomber Command Memorial in London, completed in 2012, 67 years after the end of the war, was a specific institutional acknowledgement that the government had withheld in 1945. Its dedication ceremony was attended by the last surviving Bomber Command veterans, many of whom were in their late 80s or 90s, who had waited their entire adult lives for the formal recognition that their service deserved. The memorial was appropriate. The delay was an injustice. The German cities that the bombing campaign destroyed, Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, Berlin, Dusseldorf, Essen, and dozens of others, have been rebuilt in the decades since the war, and the specific physical evidence of the bombing is now largely invisible in the rebuilt cityscapes. The specific churches and cathedrals and historic buildings that were destroyed, the artistic and architectural heritage that the area bombing campaign consumed alongside the military and industrial targets, are gone in ways that the rebuilt cities cannot fully restore. The Frauenkirche in Dresden, the Baroque Lutheran church that had been one of the most beautiful buildings in Germany, destroyed in the February 1945 raids, was rebuilt after German reunification and reconsecrated in 2005, 60 years after its destruction. The rebuilt church stands as a specific symbol of Dresden's recovery, and it is one of the most visited monuments in Germany. It is also a specific symbol of what the bombing campaign destroyed and what the decades of post-war reconstruction could only partially restore. The broader question of what the area bombing campaign destroyed in terms of European cultural heritage is one that has been addressed by the specific scholarship of art historians and architectural historians who have calculated the specific losses. The number of significant historic buildings destroyed, the specific artworks and artifacts that were burned or buried, the specific urban environments that had developed over centuries and that the bombing campaign eliminated in a matter of hours. These losses are real and significant and are part of the full accounting of what the Harris War cost. Harris understood this dimension of the cost, and his response was characteristic. These things were unfortunate but necessary. The war required it. The strategic objective justified the specific cultural losses alongside the specific civilian casualties. Whether his assessment of necessity was correct, whether the specific cultural losses could have been avoided while still achieving the strategic effects that were required, is a question that the scholarship has not fully resolved, partly because the counterfactual of a different bombing strategy is inherently speculative. The specific strategic effects that the bombing campaign did achieve, as distinct from the effects that Harris claimed it would achieve, are worth documenting because they have sometimes been obscured by the broader debate about whether area bombing was the right strategy. The German Luftwaffe was substantially degraded by the requirement to defend German cities against the bombing campaign. The anti-aircraft artillery that Germany deployed to defend its cities, more than 1 million flak guns and the personnel to operate them by 1944, was artillery that was not available for ground support on the Eastern Front or in Normandy. The specific calculation that the flak guns tied up in defending German cities were equivalent in firepower to the artillery of many divisions is one that military historians have made, and that supports the conclusion that the bombing campaign diverted significant defensive resources from a ground war. The specific attrition of German oil production, achieved primarily by the American precision bombing campaign that Harris initially opposed in favor of continued area bombing, was one of the decisive strategic effects of the Allied air campaign. The specific destruction of German synthetic oil plants from the spring of 1944 onward produced a fuel crisis in the German military that affected every aspect of the ground and air war. German tanks ran short of fuel. German aircraft could not be fully trained because of the fuel shortage for training flights. The specific industrial target that the precision bombing advocates had been arguing for turned out to be exactly as decisive as they had claimed. Harris had resisted the oil campaign, arguing that area bombing was more effective. He was wrong about the specific question, and the oil campaign's results vindicated the precision bombing advocates in ways that the historical record is clear about. The combination of the area bombing campaign's attrition of the Luftwaffe and the precision bombing campaign's destruction of oil production, neither of which Harris considered optimal, was what actually produced the decisive strategic effects on the German war economy. The specific individuals who developed the oil campaign strategy, including Sally Zuckerman, who had been arguing for precision targeting of specific economic vulnerabilities since the early years of the war, and Carl Spaatz, who commanded the American strategic bombing forces and who pressed for the oil campaign against initial resistance, deserve recognition alongside Harris in the full accounting of what the Allied strategic bombing campaign achieved and how it achieved it. Harris's specific genius was in building an operational force, in taking the dysfunctional Bomber Command of 1941 and transforming it into the 1,000-bomber force of 1942 and beyond, in developing the Pathfinder techniques that improved accuracy, in establishing the operational tempo that kept the pressure on Germany throughout the campaign. His specific failure was in the strategic theory, in the commitment to civilian area bombing, as the primary instrument rather than as one instrument among several, and in the specific resistance to the oil campaign that delayed the achievement of the most decisive strategic effects. He was a brilliant operational commander executing a flawed strategic theory. The brilliant operational execution and the flawed strategic theory both belong in the same assessment. The men who flew for him were heroes. The civilians who died under his bombs were people who deserved to live. The government that directed him and then disowned him was dishonest. The recognition that eventually came to the Bomber Command veterans was appropriate and too late. All of these things are true simultaneously. The full accounting of the Harris War requires holding all of them in the same frame. That is the Bomber War. That is what it was and what it cost and what it achieved and where it fell short and how it has been remembered and how it deserves to be remembered. Arthur Harris was born in 1892 in Cheltenham and had grown up in Rhodesia before returning to England to serve in the First World War. He had flown in the Royal Flying Corps, the predecessor of the Royal Air Force, and had developed in the interwar years a specific conviction about the potential of strategic bombing that put him among the most determined advocates of air power in the RAF. The specific doctrine that the RAF was developing in the 1930s, the doctrine that strategic bombing of enemy industry and civilian morale could by itself win wars without the grinding land battles of the First World War, was a doctrine that Harris believed in deeply and that he had spent 20 years preparing to apply. The specific justification for area bombing, for the deliberate targeting of German cities rather than the precision bombing of specific industrial and military targets, rested on two arguments that Harris made consistently throughout the war. The first was operational. Precision bombing was not achievable with the technology and the training available to Bomber Command in the early years of the war. The navigational and targeting systems of 1942 and 1943 were not capable of reliable precision in the darkness and the cloud cover that characterized operations over Germany. A bomber that was aiming at a factory was, in practice, likely to hit anything within a considerable radius of the factory. The choice was not between precision bombing of military targets and area bombing of civilian targets. It was between area bombing and no effective bombing at all. The second argument was strategic. Even if precision bombing had been achievable, the destruction of German civilian morale through area bombing would produce a strategic effect that precision targeting of individual facilities could not. Harris believed, following the pre-war doctrine of DeHead and others, that a population subjected to sustained aerial bombardment would eventually compel its government to surrender, that the German civilian population, unable to bear the weight of the bombing campaign, would turn against the Nazi regime and force it to seek peace. This second argument was wrong. The German civilian population did not rise against the Nazi regime as a result of the bombing. The evidence, developed by careful Allied analysis of German civilian morale during and after the war, suggests that the bombing had the opposite effect in the short term. It increased German civilian solidarity and identification with the war effort. It intensified hatred of the bombing powers, and it strengthened rather than weakened the Nazi regime's political control. The bombing of civilian populations, in other words, was producing the opposite of the strategic effect that Harris had promised. Harris knew this or had been told this, and he did not accept it. His conviction that the bombing campaign was decisive, that it would produce a civilian collapse that would end the war, was a conviction that he maintained with a specific stubbornness that distinguished him from most other commanders who encountered evidence that contradicted their strategic premises. He was not stupid or uninformed. He was committed to a theory that the evidence was disconfirming, and he continued to press the theory against the evidence because the operational alternative, abandoning area bombing in favor of precision targeting of the specific facilities, was one that he believed was operationally impossible. The specific operational achievement of Bomber Command under Harris was genuinely extraordinary. He received command an organization that had been failing to achieve its stated objectives. Its early precision bombing raids had produced minimal damage at high cost, and the morale bombing raids had been similarly ineffective. He rebuilt it, expanded the force, improved the navigation and targeting technology, developed the Pathfinder force that marked targets for the main bombing force, and created the operational capacity for 1,000 bomber raids that changed the scale of the campaign. The Hamburg firestorm of July 1943, Operation Gemara, was the first demonstration of what the rebuilt Bomber Command could accomplish. 4 raids in 10 days dropped approximately 9,000 tons of bombs on Hamburg, creating a firestorm in the city center that generated winds of 150 miles per hour and temperatures of 800 degrees Celsius. Approximately 37,000 people were killed. The city was largely destroyed. The impact on German morale and German war production was significant. Albert Speer told Hitler afterward that if 6 more cities were attacked like this, Germany would be unable to continue the war. 6 more cities were not attacked like Hamburg in rapid succession. The specific operational requirements of the campaign, the weather, the German defenses, the limitations on the frequency with which the force could be deployed, meant that the intensity of Hamburg could not be sustained continuously. But the Hamburg attack demonstrated what was achievable, and it supported Harris's argument that the bombing campaign could be decisive if applied with sufficient intensity and commitment. The Dresden raid is the specific event that has most defined Harris's historical legacy, not because it was the most destructive raid of the campaign, but because of the specific timing and the specific nature of the target. February 1945 was 2 months before Germany's final surrender. The war was manifestly being won by the Allied armies advancing from east and west. The specific military necessity of destroying Dresden at that moment, when the German military capability had already been largely broken, was questioned at the time and has been questioned more intensely since. Harris argued that Dresden was a legitimate military target, a rail junction, a communications center, a city that was contributing to the German war effort. These arguments were technically correct but insufficient to explain the specific decision to apply maximum force to a target that was hosting hundreds of thousands of refugees, and that had been largely spared earlier in the war. The specific decision to bomb Dresden in February 1945 reflected the same operational momentum that had carried the bombing campaign through 3 years of war, the institutional inertia of a large force that had been built to destroy German cities, and that was continuing to destroy them even as the strategic rationale for doing so was diminishing. The specific question of whether the Dresden raid was a war crime, whether the deliberate destruction of a city containing hundreds of thousands of civilian refugees, laid in a war that was already being decided by ground forces, was a crime under the laws of war as they existed in 1945, is a question that legal scholars have addressed without reaching consensus. The laws of war in 1945 did not explicitly prohibit what the Allied bombing campaign was doing. The subsequent development of international humanitarian law has produced a specific prohibition on attacks that are disproportionate in their civilian impact, which would be a relevant consideration for the Dresden case. Whether the 1945 laws of war or the subsequently developed standards should be applied is a question that the legal scholars have not resolved. What is less legally ambiguous is the broader question of the area bombing campaign's relationship to the laws of war as they were understood at the time. The specific claim that the campaign was directed at military-industrial targets rather than at civilians was formally maintained throughout the war, but the specific operational character of the area bombing raids, the deliberate concentration of incendiary bombs on civilian residential areas to create firestorms, makes the distinction between targeting military facilities and targeting civilian populations very difficult to maintain in practice. Harris understood this. He made no attempt to obscure the fact that Bomber Command was attacking civilian residential areas. He argued that the civilian residential areas were legitimate military targets because the civilians who lived in them were workers in the German war industry, and that destroying their homes and their morale was a legitimate military objective. Whether this argument satisfied the laws of war was a question that the post-war legal proceedings, which did not prosecute the Allied bombing campaign, did not resolve. The specific injustice of Harris's post-war treatment is one of the more troubling aspects of his story. Harris had been directed to conduct the area bombing campaign by the British government, by Churchill, by the War Cabinet, by the specific directives that set the targets and the strategic objectives. He had not invented the policy. He had executed it with the specific professional competence that the government had employed him to apply. The policy had produced real strategic effects. The disruption of German war production, the forcing of German air defenses to concentrate on anti-bomber operations rather than on supporting the ground forces, the specific attrition of the German Luftwaffe that made the D-Day landing possible without the air opposition that it would otherwise have faced. After the war, when the specific cost of what the bombing campaign had done to German cities became fully visible, When the photographs of Dresden and Hamburg and Cologne and a dozen other devastated cities circulated and produced a moral reckoning that the wartime censorship had delayed, the British government quietly distanced itself from Harris and from the campaign. No campaign medal was awarded to the aircrew of Bomber Command, the only major Allied military formation of the Second World War to be denied a campaign medal. Harris himself was awarded no peerage, though commanders of comparable rank in other services routinely received the honor. Harris was furious, and justified in his fury. He had done what he had been asked to do. He had built the force his government had wanted, and had applied it to the objectives his government had set. The specific moral discomfort that the campaign produced in the post-war period was not something he created alone. It was the product of a policy that the government had directed and that he had executed. The government's response, to allow Harris to bear the moral cost while quietly distancing itself from him, was a specific act of institutional cowardice that the record does not support. Harris emigrated to South Africa after the war, returned to Britain in 1953, and received a baronetcy in 1953, a lesser honor than the peerage that comparable service would normally have merited, and one that came 8 years after the war's end. He died in 1984, at 91. Having spent 40 years watching the campaign, he had conducted, debated, and condemned, and occasionally defended, and having maintained throughout that he had done what was necessary, and that the government that had asked him to do it had never adequately acknowledged the debt. He was right that the bombing campaign was an essential component of the Allied victory. He was wrong that the area bombing of civilian populations was a strategic weapon that would by itself compel Germany's surrender. He was right that the government had directed the campaign. He was wrong that the campaign was without moral cost. He was right that the men who flew the raids were heroes deserving of formal recognition. He was wrong that the civilian dead were simply the acceptable price of strategic necessity. All of these things are true simultaneously. The historical record requires holding all of them in the same assessment, without the simplification that makes Harris either a heroic commander who won the war or a war criminal who murdered civilians. He was the architect of the most destructive air campaign in history against civilian targets. He was also the commander of the force that imposed a specific attrition on German air defenses, German production, and German civilian infrastructure that the Allied ground forces needed to advance. Both things are true. Both belong in the accounting. That is the Harris War. The burning cities and the Lancasters and the men who flew them and the civilians who died under them and the government that directed it all, and then disowned the man who had done the directing. He burned German cities and was never forgiven for it. He also helped win the war. Both things are true. The full accounting requires both. The specific post-war rehabilitation of Bomber Command, the slow, incomplete, and contested process by which the campaign and its veterans have been acknowledged, is worth examining because it illuminates both the specific injustice of the initial treatment and the specific cultural dynamics that have shaped how the bombing campaign is remembered. The immediate post-war period was characterized by the specific moral discomfort that the visible evidence of what the bombing campaign had done to German cities produced in the British public and political class. The photographs of Dresden and Hamburg, the estimates of civilian casualties, the specific recognition that the Allied air forces had killed more German civilians than the German military had killed British civilians. All of this created a political and cultural atmosphere in which celebrating the bombing campaign was uncomfortable and in which distancing the government from the campaign was politically convenient. Harris understood what was happening, and his response was to be publicly outspoken about what Bomber Command had done and why, to refuse to participate in the distancing that his government was performing. His memoir, Bomber Offensive, published in 1947, was a direct and unapologetic account of the campaign and of the specific arguments for it. It was read as defiant, which it was, and it was also read as tone-deaf to the moral concerns that the campaign had raised, which it also was. The specific denial of the campaign medal, which was not reversed until a private Bomber Command campaign medal was created by the Air Forces Memorial in 2013, with no government funding, was the most visible institutional expression of the post-war distancing. The veterans of Bomber Command were aware of it and felt it as a specific insult throughout their lives. The specific bitterness of the surviving veterans about the medal, which most of them did not live to see awarded, is part of the post-war history of Bomber Command that the official celebrations have not always fully acknowledged. The Bomber Command Memorial in London, opened in 2012, funded by private donations, was a specific institutional acknowledgement that eventually came, and its dedication ceremony was attended by surviving veterans who had waited 70 years for formal recognition. The specific emotional weight of the ceremony, elderly men in their late 80s and 90s, some of them in wheelchairs, receiving the acknowledgement that their service deserved, was one of the more affecting moments in the post-war history of British military commemoration. Harris himself did not live to see the memorial. He died in 1984. The memorial was opened in 2012, 28 years later. The specific cultural debate about the bombing campaign has not been resolved by the opening of the memorial or by the subsequent scholarly engagement with the history. The debate about whether area bombing was a war crime, whether it was strategically necessary, whether it was proportionate to military objectives, and whether Harris should be honored or condemned continues in the public sphere and in the academic literature. The debate is likely to continue because the questions are genuine and the evidence does not produce clean answers. The honest position is one that acknowledges a genuine complexity, that the bombing campaign was both a significant military achievement and a moral catastrophe, that Harris was both an operationally brilliant commander and a strategically inflexible theorist, that the men who flew the missions were heroes, and that the campaign they were carrying out was morally compromised, and that the government that directed the campaign bore more responsibility than it was willing to acknowledge. Harris burned German cities. Britain told him to. The men flew and died. The civilians died. The war was won. And the full accounting requires all of it: the courage, the destruction, the strategic achievement, the civilian cost, the post-war disavowal, and the belated acknowledgement that came too late for most of those who deserved to receive it. That is the Harris War. The specific night that Harris would not be able to forget, if there was one specific night out of thousands of sorties that Bomber Command flew under his command, was probably not Dresden. It was probably one of the early raids, before the force he built had reached a scale that made it capable of the 1,000 bomber raids and the firestorms. It was probably a night when the losses were high and the damage was minimal, when the force was blundering through clouds and German defenses with navigational systems that could not find the target and bomb aiming equipment that could not hit it. Those early nights of the campaign, 1941 and early 1942, before Harris took command, and before the force had been rebuilt with the technology and the doctrine that made it effective, were the nights that established a specific character of his command when he arrived. He had inherited an organization that was failing, that was losing men at a rate that the results did not justify, and that was not achieving the strategic objectives that had been set for it. His specific achievement was to build, from this failing organization, the force that conducted the Hamburg firestorm and the Dresden raid, and hundreds of other missions between 1942 and 1945. The specific qualities required to achieve this, the organizational intelligence, the specific stubbornness, the willingness to accept criticism from above and below, while maintaining the strategic commitment to what he believed in, were real qualities that produced a real achievement. Whether the achievement justified the cost is a question that the historical record cannot answer in a way that will satisfy everyone, because the question is ultimately a moral one, and moral questions do not have answers that the historical record can confirm or deny. What the historical record can establish is a specific character of the cost and the specific character of the achievement, and can present both to the reader who has to make their own moral assessment. The cost? Approximately 300,000 German civilians killed, hundreds of thousands injured, major German cities destroyed, irreplaceable cultural heritage lost, and 55,573 RAF Bomber Command aircrew killed in the execution of the campaign. The achievement: the degradation of the German Luftwaffe's offensive and defensive capability, the diversion of significant German anti-aircraft resources from the ground war to city defense, the disruption of German industrial production and transportation, and the specific attrition of German oil production that contributed to the decisive defeat of German military capability in 1944 and 1945. Both are real. Both belong in the accounting. The moral weight of the cost against the military value of the achievement is not a calculation that the historical record can perform for the reader. It is a calculation that each reader has performed for themselves, with a full understanding of what both sides of the equation actually contained. Harris performed that calculation and concluded that the bombing was justified. Many historians have concluded that the calculation was close, that the strategic effect achieved were significant enough to justify a significant civilian cost, but that the specific degree of area bombing that Harris pursued went beyond what the military necessity required, particularly in the final months of the war. Some historians have concluded that the area bombing campaign was not justified, regardless of the strategic effects, because the deliberate targeting of civilian populations violated moral principles that should not be overridden by military necessity. The honest position acknowledges that all of these conclusions are seriously held, that the evidence supports more than one of them, and that the specific moral assessment of the bombing campaign is a question that the historical scholarship can illuminate but cannot resolve. Harris burned the cities. He helped win the war. He was discarded by his government. He lived to 91. He never acknowledged a moral critique. He died without the peerage he deserved. The memorial came 28 years after his death. The men who flew for him were heroes. The civilians who died under his bombs were people. All of this is true simultaneously. That is the Harris War. The specific communities that bore the weight of the bombing campaign. The families of aircrew who did not return, the German families who lost their homes in raids, deserve acknowledgement as part of full human dimension of what the Harris War was. The reconciliation efforts that have developed in the decades since the war, the specific relationships between British veterans and German survivors of the bombing, the exchanges between British cities and German cities that were bombed, the specific human connections that have been built across the lines of the war, are part of the post-war story that the military and strategic history tends not to engage with. The city of Coventry, itself heavily bombed by the German Luftwaffe in November 1940, as we discussed in the Churchill episode of the series, is twinned with Dresden. The specific gesture of reconciliation between a British city that was bombed and a German city that was bombed establishes a form of shared suffering that transcends the specific military and moral arguments about who was responsible for what. Both cities were destroyed in the name of military necessity. Both cities lost specific people in the specific raids. Both cities rebuilt. The twinning acknowledges the shared experience of civilian destruction without adjudicating the specific legal or moral arguments about the bombing campaigns that produced it. This specific human dimension of reconciliation, the willingness of people most directly affected by the bombing to build relationships across the lines of the war, is morally more sophisticated than the arguments about justification that the historical and legal scholarship continues to conduct. The scholarship is important. The reconciliation is also important, and the full accounting of the Harris War requires both. The Bomber Command aircrew who flew the missions and survived the war, who lived with a memory of what they had done and what they had survived for the rest of their lives, carried a specific burden that the post-war culture was not always willing to acknowledge. They had been part of a campaign that killed 300,000 civilians. They knew this. Most of them had not thought about it in those terms when they were flying. They had been thinking about their navigation and their bomb aiming and the German fighter that was on their tail. But in the years after the war, as the full scale of what the bombing campaign had done became visible, the men who had participated in it had to find ways to live with that knowledge. Some of them found this difficult. Some of them did not. The specific range of responses, from men who maintained that the bombing was entirely justified to men who carried significant guilt about what they had participated in, is part of the human record of the campaign that the official histories tend to smooth over. Harris died without publicly acknowledging any of this, without any statement that registered civilian deaths as anything other than the acceptable price of military necessity. His certainty about the justification for the campaign never wavered, and the specific quality of that certainty, whether it was a genuine conviction of a man who had made his moral calculation and was at peace with it, or whether it was a performance of certainty by a man who could not afford to acknowledge the doubts, is something that the historical record cannot establish. What the historical record establishes is the specific facts. The cities, the bombs, the dead on both sides, the strategic effects, the post-war disavowal, the belated recognition. The moral assessment of these facts is a task for each reader, with the understanding that the full complexity of what the Harris War was deserves a more sophisticated response than either simple celebration or simple condemnation. He burned the cities. He helped win the war. He was discarded by his government. He died at 91, having been right about some things and wrong about others, having been honored insufficiently and criticized excessively, and having never publicly acknowledged the full moral weight of what his campaign had cost. The men who flew for him deserve better from their government. The civilians who died under his bombs deserve to live. The government that directed the campaign bore more responsibility, that it acknowledged the historical record has been patient and thorough in assembling the full accounting.